tales for dark nights.
The following performance is a third-round entry in the 2016 Evil Idol voice acting competition, and you, the listener, get to help decide who wins. If you'd like to hear more of this contestant, voting for them is simple and only takes a moment. Just click the thumbs up icon. Can't stand them? Then click the thumbs down icon instead, and cast them into the digital netherrealm from whence they came. You decide their fate. Good luck to all of our contestants.
Spores. Written by Reddit user CreepyMonkeiBoi. Performed by Benjamin Lisman for Chilling Tales for Dark Nights and the Evil Idol competition. It was Lucy that killed me. My apartment was sealed tight. I boxed in right when the panic and the riots started. My building is an unassuming 3-story all brick and mortar in a mostly industrial district. Not the best place to live in regular world, but when the world is ending, no better. No fires or looters here. Not like Boston or San Diego. Entire cities burning with no one left to put them out. The news first reported it as a localized event in the Eastern European bloc. A new pandemic strain of influenza. Some stupid shit. I started prepping that. Spending every paycheck on water, supplies, and air filtration equipment. 6 months later, the President of the United States is on the news in a full biological hazards suit, apologizing to the world and telling everyone to pray. The government shut down soon after, but by then the spore storms were already blowing across Indiana. They referred to it as an ETO, extraterrestrial organism. Speculated that it probably landed somewhere in the mountainous region near Turkey. It was a silica-based life form, somewhere between a worm and a fungus, completely parasitic and hostile to any form it came into contact with. Insects, birds, mammals. Towards the end, they even said that it had adapted and started attaching to plants. If it comes into contact with skin, I've heard it can't be removed. The spores, they attach to whatever they land on and root it deep. 2 inches deep. This is stage 1 of an infection. Within about a week, the head will find out and become a flowering organism, releasing more spores. Stage 2.
I remember watching the news during the first spore storms in China. It was like the sky turned black. They showed soldiers burning bodies along with livestock. If a spore is inhaled, it latches inside the lungs, makes you crazy with pain. Do you become a walking infector, exhaling little clouds of parasites with each breath or cough? Eventually, in stage 4, you find a quiet, dark place to lay down and die. And the worms just sprout out of your mouth and nose, turning you into a human flower pot. Or in Lucy's case, a feline flower pot. I can see her tiny ribs flexing in and out, but she's been dead for 2 days now. The roots are wrapped around her lungs, flexing them open and closed. I can see tiny black particles spraying out of her into my apartment. I'd had my apartment sealed shut for 2 weeks. I listened to my upstairs neighbor's wet ragged coughs get weaker and stop. I watched the news until the power went off. I checked and double-checked all the seals around the windows and my air system. I watched the black stalks growing out of the mouths of the homeless guy down in the alley. When I heard Lucy crying at my door, scratching to be let in, I hadn't seen her in a month. I didn't even have cat food stocked. I don't know why I did. I knew I was dead the first time she sneezed. I felt a weird tickle back of my throat. It sends me into a coughing fit that lasts for over a minute. When I'm finally done, I can feel it just barely dripping out over my bottom lip. I look in the mirror and I can see the long black tendril disappear down my throat. I gingerly press on it with my back teeth. I feel a vice clamp down on my lungs, squeezing all the air out. I see flashing stars and blackness before it relaxes ever so slightly, allowing me to labor on for just a while longer. I'm so pissed, so angry. I open my mouth wide and wrap my hands around the cord and pulling feet of black rope out of my mouth, along with a red and bloody chunk. The vein in my right lung is when I woke up. I can see all the blood I've coughed up, flecked with black spores and tiny wriggling threads. There are now 2 more tendrils touching my bottom limb. It took me an hour to crawl over to where my tail is. It's so hard to breathe now. I won't have to bother doing it soon.
Personal Journal of Sean Whittier, Canadian astronaut serving aboard the ISS. April 2nd. CNC advises that the pandemic has spread beyond the India-China border. I can look out the viewport and see Istanbul in flames. Susie sent me an email that said there are reported infections in Los Angeles and San Francisco. I told her to pack up and go stay with her folks in SLC. This shit is scary how fast it went from a bird flu outbreak 2 months ago to some type of fungal lung disease and 10 million dead. Dmitri showed me an email from his cousin. I don't read Russian. He said that his cousin talked about there literally being dead bodies on the streets in St. Petersburg. End log. April 25th. We're getting our last shipment for a while tomorrow. We're being sequestered up here, quote, for our safety, unquote. End log. April 26th. Soyuz TMA-30M arrived with mission specialist cosmonaut Andrei Tasko on board. Module contains food and water supplies for 6 months, additional air tanks. After docking, myself and Dmitri decided to enact a temporary quarantine to monitor cosmonaut Tasko for signs of infection. He was not happy. We'll give him 12 hours, then pop the seal. End log. April 28th. We made the right call. We can see Tasko floating around inside the Soyuz. He stopped moving a few hours ago. We can clearly see black particulates floating inside. The scrubbers, for some reason, aren't filtering. We think he's putting out more spores than the module can filter. End log. May 10th. It's surreal looking inside the module. Tasko is floating around dead, bumping off the walls. There's black stalks growing from his mouth and nose, and now eye sockets. The air inside looks dirty, like smoke. HTVCC advised us that they were going offline within 24 hours. That leaves Houston, Toulouse, Quebec, and Ober. They've all gone quiet. We've only got 2 weeks of food left. There's pallets of food inside the module that we can't touch. Luckily, we're able to siphon the exterior tanks for air without cracking the door on that death trap. I can see Tasko breathing. He's dead, but his ribs are moving, and he's just pouring out spores. End log. May 13th. After purging the module yesterday, we repressurized it remotely. It looks like the infection in Tasko died out as well. He's not breathing anymore. May 14th. I was 5 seconds from cracking the door when Dmitri stopped me. We exposed it to vacuum for 8 hours. Minus 90-degree temperatures. It just went dormant. He stopped me, looking through the porthole, and said Tasko's chest was moving again. We watched the module fill back up with that black shit in 4 hours. 6 months of food 10 feet away. Now we can't even spacewalk because there's no telling if some of those spores landed on the hull. We can't risk even one getting in here. May 30th. Down to 3 bags of gravy. I can look out the window and see black hurricanes sweep across Africa. All we're getting from Houston is a standby signal. We tried raising someone on the radio and got a lot of static. Somebody in the Tulsa National Guard left a recorded message broadcasting at max frequency. All west of Mississippi are lost. Do not approach. Repeat. All lost. Stay away. June 12th. I watched Dimitri burn up on re-entry below me. He decided to go EVA 3 days ago. He suffocated long before he hit Atma. Said he wanted to go out on his terms. I kind of envy him now. I'm too weak to suit up. The surface doesn't look like Earth anymore. The spore storms are sweeping across every landmass. It's like the entire world burned to ash. No luck on comms. I'm not sure anyone's left standing down there. Houston's standby message went dark. That National Guard message is still playing, though. End log. June 14th. I cracked the seal. It was the best goddamn bag of turkey and gravy I've ever eaten. I've been coughing non-stop for 4 hours, and there are 1-inch black threads growing out of my arms and face. But fuck it, if I'm not gonna die well fed. Next meal is spaghetti and orange juice. I might pop the airlock and join Dimitri later. Maybe I'll just stay here with Haskell. Oh God, it's so good to eat.
Patient 1 is currently in stage 1 infection and quarantined in a biological containment suit. Patient 1 was exposed as a result of improper decontamination procedures following a sample collection in Greater Los Angeles area. Patient 1, formerly corporal in the United States Army, was sequestered and discharged from service for observation following his infection due to negligent handling of sample trays in the entry tunnel to Facility Delta 2. Patient 1 displays symptoms of infection by 2 ETO sporocytes on his left forearm. Sporocyte organism was measured to have begun rooting into the upper dermal layer after approximately 15 minutes. Prior to this, contaminant can effectively be removed by thorough washing. Patient 1 was forcibly restrained from attempting to remove ETO until after they had effectively implanted. Sporocytes grew into dermal layer and underlying muscle and fat tissue at a rate of 2 centimeters per hour, while simultaneously extending out from point of contact at slightly slower rate. After 4 hours, the 2 spores had rooted to a depth of 1 inch and extending out of the dermis as a black tendril approximately 0.5 millimeters in length. 1 tendril was removed at skin, which resulted in patient 1 experiencing significant localized discomfort, likely defensive response from remaining root. The stalk regrew at a similar rate as before, returning to comparable length. After approximately 6 hours, second spore tendril began flattening and hollowing until it resembled a blade of grass. At this time, we were able to detect tendril releasing 40 parts per cc of new spore cells every hour. This tendril was removed by surgical excision, removing root as well as head. Damage to patient's 1 muscles and dermal tissue to effect this removal was moderate. By time this procedure was complete, the first spore tendril had begun to flatten in preparation for seeding. Patient 1 was prepared for follow-up surgery to excise his spore. It was discovered during surgery that this spore root had grown deeper in response to previous experimentation. Root had wrapped around the ulna 3 times and grown into bone marrow. Patient 1's arm was removed and he was declared free from infection after monitoring for 12 hours. Patient 2 was brought in at stage 3 infection, having been exposed to inhaled airborne spores approximately 10 hours earlier. Patient 2 is 44-year-old African-American male exposed from close proximity to infected family members. Patient 2 received rudimentary medical care at Reno Regional Hospital prior to facility being declared black zone. Patient 2 shows signs of dermal infection in 12 locations on body and was determined to be substantially infected in lungs and trachea by endoscopic examination. Patient 2 was measured to be outputting approximately 80 spores per cc of each inhaled breath. Patient 2 also displayed 4 tendrils that had grown inside lungs front to mouth and had begun to protrude. Patient 2 indicate extreme difficulty breathing and discomfort. Patient 2 monitored for 4 hours and was found to have perished sometime during that time frame. Patient 2 was mistakenly believed to be alive due to tendril roots continuing to contract Patient 2's lungs to further reproduction process. Patient 2 disposed of by incineration. Patient 3 is currently in stage 2 infection of both lung and dermal variety. Patient 3 was exposed due to improper or inadequate decontamination procedure following surgery on Patient 1. Patient 3 was formerly employee of this facility, but was sequestered and her employment terminated after she was found to be attempting to conceal symptoms of infection inside her assigned lab area. All exposed staff were placed into quarantine for observation. Patients 4 through 12 are all in stage 2 infection of lung and dermal variety. All patients are formerly staff of facility exposed due to actions of Patient 3. Samples 13 and 14 are in stage 4 of infection and deceased at time of their discovery. Both samples exposed due to improper or inadequate decontamination procedures during sequestration of patients 4 through 12. Samples 13 and 14 were located inside the B4 men's restroom, handicap stall, and inside office B115. Both samples estimated to have been exposed approximately 20 hours before. Facility Delta 4 reclassified as Black Zone.
Susan slid the window open on her 4th-floor condo. Outside, she heard the sound of traffic on 84th Street. Although it was late on a Saturday afternoon, the city was busy, especially on her street where there were 2 grocery stores and a Target. Susan heard the screeching of tires, followed by a loud crunch. She could hear the argument from inside, peppered with profanities. Chicago was under a mandatory boil order, and the governor's office was advising citizens to remain inside unless absolutely necessary. Of course, this led to a rush on the local grocery stores. Susan finally walked over to the window and could see a black Dodge truck that had flattened the trunk of a yellow cab. A CPD officer had already arrived, and the 2 drivers were involved in a heated, although quieter argument, with a very young officer between them. Susan scooped up her softly breathing Datsun and laid him on the windowsill. She smiled. Outside, she saw a fight break out between 2 Hispanic women walking on the sidewalk. Both of them were wearing white surgical masks and screaming something that she couldn't understand. They quickly resorted to blows, and the 2 women fell to the ground grappling. The young officer sprinted down the street and ineffectively tried to pull them apart. Susan grabbed her coat and keys. She pulled the coat on over her arms, covering the 9 fully formed stalks on her arms. Susan doubled over, hacking and coughing just as she was reaching for the door. A cloud of black spore sprayed out onto the wall, flecked with blood. She smiled and looked back to Pepper lying on the windowsill. His chest was rising up and down, but his open eyes were glassy and lifeless. He had taken the spore into his lungs so fast, Susan thought to herself, much faster than she did. She felt so much pride looking at him now, spreading the rapture into the air. Susan had been planning this for weeks, ever since the EU had declared a state of emergency and closed all borders for member countries. She had felt such a strong calling. She knew that this was the purpose of her life. She wasn't the only one. She had made so many friends online, people like her that knew that this was the path to returning the earth to a pure state, a clean form devoid of the real plague of humanity. It had been her friend Halem in India that helped her join the purification. He had smuggled samples out of Iran and shipped them to a contact in the Philippines just before the docks in his country were closed. Susan had received the package just last week, an infected dove with black stalks growing from its rotting body. Susan remembered her excitement when she was opening it. Pepper was whimpering in the corner, but he just didn't know how important he was. She sliced open the bag and untied the plastic bag inside, gagging at the smell. She realized with excitement that the bag had originally been clear, but the inside was coated with black spores. Susan closed and locked the door behind her. She wasn't planning on returning. She walked out of her front door onto the crowded street. Most of the people walking by were wearing some form of mask. The officer had left already, and the 2 cars had been left on the street, drivers nowhere in sight. A line of idling cars with impatient-looking drivers sat behind them, unaware that their owners had abandoned them. An older man without a mask walked around her. She leaned forward and coughed into his path. He recoiled in horror, his eyes wide in shock before hurrying off, covering his mouth with his sleeve. "Fucking bitch!" she heard him mutter as he departed. She grinned, feeling the first tendril in her mouth drag across the inside of her lip, seeking an opening. She gingerly shifted it around, stroking the strand softly with her tongue like a lover. A woman walking with a toddler passed by. The toddler reached out to her innocently. Susan slightly pulled up her sleeve and let the little girl touch her hands on a stalk coming out of her arm. The girl smiled brightly as her clueless mother, focused on the crowd in front of her, tugged her along. Susan walked along the sidewalk more slowly than the crowd, and they flowed around her. She held out her hands, rubbing them on strangers, trying to stroke bare flesh wherever she could. She coughed and exhaled into the faces of everyone near her without a mask. Some noticed and hurried away from her. A young black man that she very conspicuously coughed on screamed a tirade of obscenities at her. He stopped when she couldn't help but smirk at him and unceremoniously slugged her across the face with a powerful right hook. She staggered backwards into the crowd, knocking over an Asian couple. Although it took her a moment to realize what happened and recover, she made sure to cough and touch the faces of both husband and wife as they got up. They apologized to her, and Susan found that hilarious. She continued for hours, walking through the grocery stores, touching unsuspecting shoppers, leaving black smears on cans and packages of food. She even spent an hour in Target, standing behind a box fan that she had taken out of the package and plugged in, just breathing out. She did that until a customer had come over and taken the fan and put it in their shopping cart. She walked around the stores, spreading the savior to thousands of people. She watched the shelves slowly empty of food, but that didn't stop the throngs of desperate and panicked people from filing through, looking to buy anything to bolster their supplies. A young woman no older than 18 stopped next to her in an aisle, a covered baby carrier in her shopping cart. Susan pulled back the cover and saw a sleeping infant. She kissed her finger and softly stroked it across the baby's lips. She looked up and made eye contact with the mother. Susan walked away, leaving the mother standing there, open-mouthed and stunned. Susan continued until her coughing became consistent and uncontrollable. A black tendril started peeking between her lips, and she curled it back inside her mouth with her tongue. This resulted in a brief crushing sensation in her chest, which caused her to collapse in an aisle. No one stopped to help her. Eventually, the looks from passerbys changed from indifference to disgust, and eventually to anger, as she found herself in frequent coughing fits. A pair of men began following her, and when she turned into an empty aisle whose shelves had already been cleaned out, one of the men followed her and planted a powerful kick in the middle of her back. It took her 30 minutes to finally rise to her feet and stagger away, leaving a puddle of blood, speckled with black, wriggling threads. She walked outside into a crush of people trying to get inside a drugstore across the street. Weak and disoriented, she unsuccessfully tried to push her way into the crowd, but was violently shoved back onto her butt by a white woman who looked no younger than 70. A middle-aged, Middle Eastern man picked her up by her arm and helped her away from the mass of people. "Are you okay?" he asked her. Susan nodded, wiping a smear of blood off of her chin and onto the man's face. He stepped backward, a look of shock and horror on his face, not unlike the young mother had given her earlier. She racked a ball of mucus in the back of her throat and spat it squarely onto the man's chest. He recoiled as though he had been shot and disappeared into the crowd. Susan staggered down the street, stopping briefly outside of an electronics shop to watch a news report about rioting outside stores in the city. The scrolling bar at the bottom read that there were confirmed outbreaks of the mysterious disease in Oklahoma and St. Louis, Missouri. National Guard soldiers had been mobilized in those areas as part of a declaration of martial law. Susan remembered her friend Tim from the forums. She remembered that he lived somewhere outside of Oklahoma City. She wondered if he had gotten his package from Halem. The purification was spreading across the world, wiping the garbage away. Susan went into a dark alley between buildings, and with the last bit of strength she had in her body, she climbed the ladder up a nearby fire escape, stripped off her clothes, and lay down on the landing. Susan lay there in the dark and watched the constant stream of people walking by. She hated them, every one of them. She hated them like she hated her parents for putting her into a psychiatric hospital at 16 after several suicide attempts. She hated them like she hated her therapist, who constantly tried to convince her to voluntarily enter a group home, like she hated her probation officer, like she hated her landlord for posting the eviction order on her door 2 weeks ago. She was so happy to become something else, something better. She curled up into the fetal position and ran her tongue over the 2 stalks that curled out of her mouth and reached upward along her cheek. She rubbed her hands gently on the stalks on her arms, feeling them pulse in the muscles of her arms as they were touched. She rhythmically breathed in and then out, releasing a tiny cloud of spores each time. She continued, long after she died. Evan dropped the dirty gloves into the red hazard trash can next to the workstation and leaned back into his chair. He thought about picking up the phone again, but decided to just be patient. No sense in panicking, he thought to himself. Evan had flown into Istanbul 2 weeks ago on a work visa for what he described to the consulate as meteorological survey work. In truth, Evan was a rock chaser for major universities in the U.S. and Europe. Colleges paid handsomely for verified meteorite samples, especially those that had landed recently. It was lucrative work, but as Evan discovered, completely dependent on the whims of the solar system. When Evan had gotten notice that an object had entered atmosphere and made groundfall, he started working immediately on obtaining his visa through the Turkish government. Turkey, at least, was a moderately developed country, and although the Minister of Interior representative he spoke to directly eyed him skeptically, he rightfully had no justification to deny him. Evan's work, although profit-motivated, was legitimate. The samples would go to scholarly institutions. Unlike the droves of rock hunters that descended on landing sites looking to make a quick buck selling their wares on the internet, Evan had collected referrals at every major university in the States and throughout Europe, which the minister quickly tired of calling. In truth, Evan preferred the simplicity of working in foreign countries. With his visa, he had written authorization to search for and retrieve any samples he could find. In the U.S., he often found himself obtaining permits from local jurisdictions, then now claiming ownership of all the results of his work. He trained in from the capital city of Erzurum, where he spent several days procuring supplies and guides to work for him. The object was recorded as having made landfall somewhere in the mountains near the border of Georgia. Evan thought back to 4 days ago when one of his guides, Fidan, had approached him outside his tent. Come see, the boy had said. Evan had obliged the boy mostly to humor him. The boy led him just past a nearby ridge and near a clear mountain stream. There, next to the water, lay a hawk, black stalks growing from between its feathers and from its mouth. Fidan had tried to get close to the bird, but Evan pulled him away. Don't get close to that thing. That's probably mold. You'll get sick, Evan told him, and the boy looked away towards the bird, disappointed. Did you touch it already? Evan asked. Fidan shook his head no. The next day, their courier from Erzurum arrived with supplies. He told Evan that he could not return until 10 days, as he was delivering medicine to a village west of them. The village had come down with sickness that spread rapidly among the people and livestock. Later that day is when Evan found the rabbit outside of camp, weak and sickly looking with more of those black stalks growing from its back. Carefully, Evan had taken a sample of the infection and had one of his men burn the animal away from their sight. The phone next to him rang, and he quickly jerked the receiver up. Mabule? He said.
Evan, is that you, my friend?
Responded the voice on the other end. Evan had called an old colleague from his days at the biology department at Stanford, before he had switched his major. Mabule Jernan was a marine biologist who worked in California. Hey, Mac, I wanted to get your insight on some organism that I've collected samples of here in Turkey. I've never seen anything like it. I know it's not your primary field, but I know you were born and raised here, and I figured if anyone would know.
Of course, Evan. I also got your email with the photographs and spectral analysis. I'm sorry that it took me so long to get back to you. What I am looking at seems like some kind of fungus or mold species, obviously parasitic. Maybe some variation of the cordyceps fungus. I've never seen one that attacks mammals, though. It's definitely not indigenous to that region. Have only animals been affected?
I'm not sure. I've heard some chatter about people being affected, Evan said.
If that is true, this could be something to worry about. If you can safely do so, I would like you to send a sample to a friend in Cairo that specializes in these types of organisms. I will contact my uncle, who works for the Council of Ministers, and make sure they are aware.
After briefly talking about family and old friends, Evan said goodbye to Mabule, still with a sick feeling in his gut. Hours later, Evan was woken up by Afrit shaking his shoulder. Mr. Evan, he whispered, please come now. Fidan is sick. Evan grabbed his glasses and slid into his shoes as he followed Afrit into the brisk night air. He was led to the makeshift outhouse at the edge of the camp, where Afrit handed Evan a flashlight and pointed at the door. Evan wrapped his shirt up over his nose and mouth, somewhat to protect himself from any illness, but mostly to cover the rancid stench that he knew was inside. Evan turned on his light and slowly cracked open the door. He shone his light over the figure of a young boy who sat in the corner quietly sobbing. On the boy's arms were several thick black ribbons. Fidan looked up with red, watery eyes. I'm sorry, Mr. Evan, Fidan blurted out. I tried to move the bird before you told me not to, and I lied to you. Evan noticed a deep, bloody hole in the boy's arm and a large amount of blood on the boy's shirt. I tried to take them off, but it hurts badly. The boy had to be taken to Erzurum by one of his workers in the bed of their work truck. Evan expressly told them not to touch the boy's arms. He didn't know if that would matter. The next morning, he called Mabule again. His friend answered on the second ring.
Evan, are you there?
Mac said, obvious concern in his voice. I'm here, Mac. It's jumped to humans. A boy here got sick last night, Evan said.
Dear God,
Mabule breathed.
Evan, my friend, you must listen. I spoke to my uncle. This organism, it is dangerous. Many people are sick. Some are dead. Have you had any direct contact with infected animals or the boy?
No, well, yes, I don't remember, Evan said.
Evan, you must leave now. Get away from that place.
Evan started nodding, then paused. The truck. Oh my God, Mac, they took the boy to the city with our truck. I can't leave here.
You must find a way to leave. The government is sending planes to stop.
The line suddenly went dead, cutting off Mambolet's warning. Evan tried dialing out again several times, without success. He walked outside and looked around. A flock of birds flew overhead away from the mountains. Evan heard a pair of jets pass overhead in the distance, and he felt and heard loud booming from the payload that they dropped. Smoke was pouring off the nearby ridge, blotting out the rising sun. Evan stood there in shock for a few minutes, before simply sitting down in the dirt. Another series of explosions, closer this time, sounded over the camp. He scratched at the back of a small black mole that had appeared overnight on his cheek. Brent leaned back in his chair and gave a speculative look to his Secretary of Defense, Hugh Frakes. After a moment, he waved his hand dismissively in the air in front of him.
Just tell the Russians that the Triumph will be pulled back by tonight, he said.
Hugh scribbled something down onto a pad of paper, tore the top page off, and handed it to a waiting aide behind him.
Brent, I believe they're going to want the subs out as well. Peruvian has been edgy the last few weeks. This pandemic in China has got him seeing ghosts.
Then let him ask for that. They stay on station until then, Brent answered.
What about our World Health inspectors? Have we gotten a report back yet?
Another man at the table spoke up.
So we haven't been able to contact them in Kuwait since Wednesday. Last reports were disturbing, to say the least. What are we looking at here, Tim?
The Prime Minister asked him. Tim adjusted his glasses and looked at the report in his hand.
Our team reports that it's parasitic fungal-type organism, possibly not terrestrial in origin, extremely dangerous and infectious across multiple species. So far, they've seen it spread by avian, mammal, and insect vectors.
Timothy paused at this and looked up, expecting someone to interject. When no one did, he looked back down and continued.
Incubation period is virtually non-existent. Once infected, a diseased organism will start spreading the infection within 24 hours. Infected generally remain completely viable for 1 to 2 weeks before eventually succumbing. Insect vectors even longer as they don't suffer lung infection.
What do the Chinese have to say about their own spread?
Brent asked.
We haven't gotten a response back since last week. They're strangely quiet. No media in out either.
And the Americans? Do they have input? Timothy leaned back and received a piece of paper from his own aide behind him. He took a moment to review it.
Washington is reporting minor outbreaks in Chicago, New York City, St. Louis, and San Francisco. Spread patterns atypical from what we've seen. They're looking at it as a terrorist act. I should mention that Paris just sent over a communique that they're starting to see infected wildlife in the south near the coast.
And how about potential response options?
Hugh inquired.
We've got a 2-month stockpile of antibiotics and antifungals and are distributing them to major medical centres. London metro area is fully stocked. We're pretty confident that we can manage an outbreak. We've enacted screening procedures on all incoming flights and shipping for infected regions. We've been successful at catching people trying to sneak through thus far.
Brent shook his head in agreement.
All right then, Matthew. How are we looking on finances? What kind of hit are we going to take from this?
Matthew Fenbender, chief finance advisor for the Prime Minister, started passing out documents to the table and had just opened his mouth to speak when he was interrupted by a Royal Navy admiral that approached the table.
Mr. Smithson, we've just gotten word that the captain of the Defender stopped 2 small container ships, the Young and the Hammerfell, both bearing South African flags steaming towards the coast near Plymouth.
All right, dock them and have them run through the screening process,
Brent said.
Sir?
The Admiral paused briefly while he considered how to approach the topic.
The ships were loaded with hundreds of infected refugees, mostly deceased. The Young and the Hammerfell were sunk at sea. Several sailors are undergoing decontamination. Sir, all the motor launches from Young were missing. They think some of the passengers fled the boat once they made sight of land.
Let's have some security sweeps focus in the area and round these people up. Go ahead and release a warning bulletin to the residents there to avoid contact with anyone they believe might be non-local. Oh, sorry, Matthew. Go ahead with what you were saying.
Brent leaned back in his chair and gave a speculative look to his Secretary of Defense, Hugh Frakes. After a moment, he waved his hand dismissively in the air in front of him.
Just tell the Russians that the Triumph will be pulled back by tonight, he said.
Hugh scribbled something down into a pad of paper, tore the top page off, and handed it to a waiting aide beside him.
Brent, I believe they're going to want the subs out as well. Peruvian has been edgy the last few weeks. This pandemic in China has got him seeing spooks. Then let him ask for that. They stay on station until then, Brent answered. What about our World Health inspectors? Have we gotten a report back yet?
Another man at the table spoke up. Sir, we haven't been able to contact them in Kuwait since Wednesday. Last reports were disturbing, to say the least.
What are we looking at here, Tim?
The Prime Minister asked him. Tim adjusted his glasses and looked at the report in his hand. Our team reports that it is parasitic fungal-type organism, possibly not terrestrial in origin, extremely dangerous and infectious across multiple species. So far they've seen it spread by avian, mammal, and insect vectors. Timothy paused at this and looked up, expecting someone to interject. When no one did, he looked back down and continued. Incubation period is virtually non-existent. Once infected, a diseased organism will start spreading the infection within 24 hours. Infected generally remain completely viable for 1 to 2 weeks before eventually succumbing. Insect vectors even longer, as they don't suffer lung infection.
What do the Chinese have to say about their own spread?
Brent asked. We haven't gotten a response back since last week. They're strangely quiet. No media in or out either.
And the Americans? Do they have input?
Timothy leaned back and received a piece of paper from his own aide behind him. He took a moment to review it. Washington is reporting minor outbreaks in Chicago, New York City, St. Louis, and San Francisco. Spread patterns atypical from what we've seen. They're looking at it as a terrorist action. I should mention that Paris just sent over a communique that they're starting to see infected wildlife in the south near the coast.
And how about our potential response options?
Hugh inquired. We've got a 2-month stockpile of antibiotics and antifungals and are distributing them to major medical centres. London metro area is fully stocked. We're pretty confident that we can manage an outbreak. We've enacted screening procedures on all incoming flights and shipping from infected regions. We've been successful at catching people trying to sneak through thus far. Brent shook his head in agreement.
All right then, Matthew. How are we looking on finances? What kind of a hit are we going to take from this?
Matthew Fenbender, Chief Finance Advisor for the Prime Minister, started passing out documents to the table and had just opened his mouth to speak when he was interrupted by a Royal Navy admiral that approached the table.
Mr. Smithson, we've just gotten word that the captain of the Defender stopped 2 small container ships, the Young and the Hammerfell, both bearing South African flags, steaming towards the coast near Plymouth. All right, dock them and have them run through the screening process, Brent said. Sir.
The Admiral paused briefly while he considered how to approach the topic.
The ships were loaded with hundreds of infected refugees, mostly deceased. The Young and the Hammerfell were sunk at sea. Several sailors are undergoing decontamination, sir. All the motor launches from Young were missing. They think some of the passengers fled the boat once they made sight of land. Let's have some security sweeps, focus in the area and round these people up. And go ahead and release a warning bulletin to the residents there to avoid contact with anyone they believe might be non-local. Sorry, Matthew. Go ahead with what you were saying.
Luke checked the seal on his mask again, before pulling the fur-lined hood on his parka over the mask. The weather was picking up again, and he didn't want the cold temperature to crack the rubber. He was wearing a full, dry diving suit underneath the winter clothes. 4 months ago, the insulation wasn't necessary, but with the Shrike storms rapidly changing the global climate, he had to adapt again. And adapt he had. Adapted and survived, for much longer than everyone else. Luke had repurposed an old diving suit to protect him from infection, and thus far it had worked well. An abandoned clean room at the local university science lab made for an adequate shelter. He would use the decontamination room to wash off the spore on the outside of his suit, followed by a UV heat wash at 160 degrees to kill whatever remained. It was a painful and long process, but so far had kept him alive. Luke looked over the edge of a small hill that led into the warehouse parking lot. It wasn't steep, but he knew that the black furry coating that used to be grass would be as slippery as ice. He carefully angled his legs and allowed gravity to slide him down the hill, and he came to a stop just short of asphalt. He trudged across the parking lot, listening to the sound like fine grit sand blasting against his face mask as the wind picked up. Although it offered ample warmth, the fur lining of the parka was black with spore. He would never be able to decontaminate it and left it outside when he showered off his dry suit. Luke eventually reached the front glass doors and read the words, "Yo Man Moving in Storage." It was unlikely that he would find food supplies here, but he might find candles and matches, and hopefully a survivor nest with some cans of food remaining. Luke pulled the crowbar off the sling on his back and jammed it between the doors, which snapped apart easily. Cheap shit lock, he thought to himself. He only carried a pry bar with him anymore. He hadn't seen another survivor in over 3 months, and the pistol he had liberated from a dead cop in a cruiser with stalk growing out of his eyes and mouth just seemed pointless anymore. Luke stepped inside and allowed the door to close behind him. The dim light from the outside allowed him some visibility of the interior hallway, but he used a small penlight to look around anyway. Most of the storage lockers had the locks cut open and were open. Their contents littered into the hallway. He picked a direction and headed off, hoping to find something of value left behind. Luke had barely made it around the corner when he sensed movement behind him.
"Who are you?"
a gruff voice asked him. Luke wheeled around, crowbar raised, and found himself staring down the barrel of a shouldered shotgun. Outmatched, he slowly lowered the crowbar to his side.
"Just looking for supplies,"
Luke said. The man lowered his gun to his waist, but kept it pointed at him. Luke noticed he was wearing a yellow biohazard suit that went up to his neck, and a full-face diving mask.
"Might have a few to spare. I'm Zeke. What's your name, boy?"
the man asked, before scratching absent-mindedly underneath the collar to his mask. This detail did not escape Luke, nor the undeserved courtesy. He had seen what happened to some of the infected, the ones that knew they were going to die. They often just wanted someone around to share in their misery. He had seen this firsthand with his own mother. She'd come home from the hospital after being gone for nearly 40 hours. The first thing she'd done was walk up to his dad and embrace him.
"Asked you a question, boy,"
Zeke repeated. Careful or he ain't going to let you leave here, he thought.
"I'm Luke Thiel. Nice to meet you."
No sense not using my real name.
"You said you have supplies?" "Supplies? Oh yeah, food, bottled water. Got a lot of that. Why don't you come with me and we can swap stories over a cup of ramen?"
Zeke said, again scratching at something underneath his collar. Luke noticed that the hose coming from the back of the helmet that should have led to an air supply was actually just dangling loosely at the man's back.
"Sure, that sounds great. Lead the way,"
Luke said, mustering all the cheerfulness he could in his voice. He felt like he had about a 50-50 shot of getting out of the warehouse alive. Zeke eyed him warily for a second, before gesturing to Luke's right with the muzzle of the shotgun.
"You can leave the bar out here. Get it on your way out. My safe room is right down here," he said.
Luke shrugged his shoulders before tossing the crowbar into the storage unit with a loud clanging. This caused Zeke to ever so slightly lower his gun, and his guard. Luke walked toward Zeke as if to go past him. As Zeke started to turn alongside him, Luke's hand darted out and grabbed the free dangling end of the air hose. He yanked hard as he sprinted forward, yanking Zeke's helmet sideways on his head and spinning him slightly off balance. The shotgun roared loudly in the hallway, and Luke felt the percussion of the blast as he sprinted for the nearest corner. Luckily, Zeke was just blind firing and came nowhere close to hitting his target. Luke sprinted down the hallways, taking turns wherever they came up in the hallway to confuse his pursuer. He became disoriented, and at one point rounded a corner to find himself behind Zeke running away from him, his helmet now discarded. Luke caught a momentary glimpse of the black ribbons growing from the man's neck. He worked his way back outside, following unlit exit signs. Near an emergency exit, he happened to spot a bulk pack of candy bars. He quickly snatched them up and burst through the doorway to the outside. After he finished decontaminating his suit, Luke placed the chocolate candy into the sample tray that led to the interior labs. They wouldn't survive the heat wash, so he'd have to clean them in a detergent bath later. After 10 minutes of heat bath, Luke stepped into the lab and peeled the suit from his drenched body. His 6-year-old brother Isaac was waiting for him. "You took a long time," Isaac said. "Find anything good to eat?" "Maybe," Luke said. "Is it your birthday?" "It was last week. You didn't get me anything," his brother complained. "Well, too bad. Just 349 more days, though, right?" Isaac folded his arms over his chest at this and pouted. Luke smiled and rubbed his little brother's hair playfully. He'd share the candy with him later, but for right now he just needed to sleep. Luke crawled onto a cot in the side office area and passed out immediately. He slept fitfully, disturbed by dreams of his father making him promise to take care of his younger brother. His father said this to him from outside the car that he had locked them in. Luke remembered seeing the black stalk just barely peeking out from underneath his father's mustache.
"You take care of Isaac. You keep the both of you safe for as long as you can, but stay together, you understand?"
He woke up suddenly at a strange noise. He looked over at his watch, 9:30 p.m. He'd slept for almost 20 hours, and his stomach grumbled in protest. He sat up in his cot and rubbed his neck. He heard the noise again, a soft coughing noise. Luke stood up and walked to the main lab area. Isaac sat in an office chair. Surrounding him were several empty chocolate bar wrappers. He could see chocolate smeared on his brother's face. "I don't feel good," Isaac said. "Of course you don't," Luke answered. "You can't eat that much candy and—" He froze in mid-step from approaching his brother. What he thought were chocolate smears on his brother's face were clearly a small forest of stalk growing from his lip and chin. The candy. I hadn't cleaned it yet. I just left it in the tray. Luke backed away into the decontamination suite, dragging his suit along with him, and slapped the door close button, sealing himself in the room. He breathed heavily and watched his brother come to the door window and look at him pensively. "Luke, what's the matter? Why are you leaving? Am I going to get sick like Mommy and Daddy?" Isaac said. Luke didn't answer. He just stared at his little brother, and then started pulling on his dry suit. He listened, detached, as his brother protested, then begged, then started crying. But Luke's mind was already working out a plan, adapting. "I'll suit up. I got enough air to make it to the dive shop to pick up another tank. There's food inside the hospital. I just have to find a way to clean it when I make it to... Where am I going?" He remembered his father's words to him and realized that he misunderstood the true instructions. He had only heard the first part before, but now all he heard in his head was, "Stay together." His brother's wailing had turned into soft sobbing. Luke suddenly realized that the entire time he had been dressing, he was also crying, and he felt the cold, salty tears drying on his cheeks. He had kept them both safe for as long as he could. Now he needed to finish his father's last request. He pulled off his helmet and stepped back inside.
Thank you for listening. If you haven't already, don't forget to cast your vote for this contestant via either a thumbs up or thumbs down vote. By doing so, you'll help us determine who will become the next permanent member of our voice acting team. At the close of voting on September 23rd, based on your votes, the top 5 contestants will progress to the 4th and final round to take place live on October 31st at our annual Halloween live stream event, based entirely on your votes. Thank you for voting and for helping to spread the word. You're listening to Chilling Tales for Dark Nights. I'm Steve Taylor, host of Chilling Tales, the podcast, encouraging you to turn off the lights and turn on the dark.
Chilling tales for dark nights.